This is lecture 113 in the ABCs of Communism series. And this set of lectures is accompanying, or will accompany, volume 7 on communism in Europe when it appears later in the year. Our subject today is Feudalism to Capitalism in Iberia. Last time we talked about the entire matter of feudalism to capitalism in general. So now we're going to go back to Europe. We did Italy before, now we're going to go into Iberia. The Kingdom of Castile that occupied northern and central portions of the Iberian Peninsula, the Kingdom of Aragon that occupied the northeastern portions of the peninsula, and the Kingdom of Portugal, occupying the far western Iberian Peninsula, were the principal papist countries of Western Europe. The death of King Henry IV of Castile in AD 1474 set off a 5-year-long civil war over the succession. The contenders were Henry's one-time heir, Joana la Belthaneja, supported by Portugal and France, and his half-sister Queen Isabel I of Castile, supported by the Kingdom of Aragon and by the Castilian nobility. Isabel retained the throne and ruled jointly with her husband, King Fernando II. Now, Isabel and Fernando had married in AD 1469 in Valladolid, setting the stage for the Kingdom of Spain. In the first phase, each region retained its own administrative structure. In the second phase, beginning on the 15th of January of 1474, Isabel held primary authority over newly unified Spain, and this satisfied the Castilian parasitocracy. Rodrigo Borgia, as Pope Alexander VI, then declared them the Catholic monarchs and authorized them to initiate Phase 3 to reconquer lost Iberian territory. The Reconquista began with the expulsion of the Moors, the conquest of Granada and the Canary Islands. Its final phase featured expulsion of the Jews and the Muslims, and Spain established colonies in North Africa that ranged from the Atlantic Moroccan coast to Tripoli in Libya. In AD 1497, Melilla was occupied, and Ceuta was annexed from the Portuguese in 1668. Now, over the next half-century, half of the estimated 80,000 Spanish Jews converted to Christianity, becoming conversos. The final step was taken by the Catholic monarchs in 1492, when they ordered the remaining Jews to convert or face expulsion from Spain, and about 40,000 did leave. In the following decades, Muslims faced the same fate, and by 1550 they were compelled to convert, becoming Moriscos. All Roma, that is gypsy males between the ages of 18 and 26, were forced to serve in galleys, which was equivalent to a death sentence, and most of them fled. Isabel gets the Pope's permission to use terror. On 1 November 1478, Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabel I of Castile received permission from Pope Sixtus IV to name inquisitors throughout their domain. Isabel was intent on terrorizing all opposition to her rule, and the Catholic Inquisition, first used in Paris in 1242, was her idea of legitimizing the threat of death by torture. In 1481, the first Iberian auto da fe took place in Seville, where 6 men and women were executed. In 1483, King Fernando extended the terror policy to Aragon, and the monarchs immediately began establishing permanent trials and developing bureaucracies to conduct investigations in cities and towns of their kingdom. In 1485, their inquisitor Pedro de Arrues was assassinated by nobles fearing their names were on the kill list. Between 1487 and 1505, the Catholic inquisitors of Barcelona processed over 1,000 people, of which 25 were able to raise enough money for their captors to be absolved. Juan Antonio Llorente, a secretary of the Holy Office, gave the following numbers for the Inquisition, excluding the American colonies. Sicily and Sardinia, 31,912 burnt, 17,696 burned in effigy, and 291,450 reconciled by performing acts of penance, paying the inquisitors, in other words. Later in the 19th century, José Amador de los Rios gave even higher numbers, stating that between the years 1484 and 1525 alone, 28,540 were burned in person, 16,520 burned in effigy, and 303,847 were penanced or freed by bribery. The Hinge of Fate. Isabel and Fernando authorized the 1492 expedition of Cristobal Colon, Christopher Columbus, to find an alternate route to the Spice Islands and Japan. On 3 tiny ships, the great admiral made it to the Bahamas. He did not know where he was when he got there, and he did not know where he had been when he got back. However, much of that disappointment disappeared when the greatest discovery of gold in the history of Europe was made on the island of Hispaniola in 1498. The initial disappointment of the Catholic monarchs in what Colon had found was swept away in joy when the mines of Hispaniola paid off so handsomely. The Hinge of Fate opened the door to Spain becoming the dominant power in Europe, that is, until the crown threw its hegemony away at an expensive, never-to-be-recovered cost, with its loss of the Great Fleet to the Brits in 1588. At any rate, Isabel had ensured long-term political stability of Spain by arranging strategic marriages for each of her 5 children. Her firstborn, a daughter named Isabel, married Alfonso of Portugal. This forged an important future between these 2 neighboring countries. Juana, Isabel's second daughter, married into the Habsburg dynasty when she wed Philip the Fair, the son of Maximilian I, King of Bohemia, that is Austria, and likely heir to the crown of the Holy Roman Emperor. Isabel's only son, Juan, married Margaret of Austria, further strengthening the ties with the Habsburg dynasty. Isabel's 4th child, Maria, married Manuel I of Portugal, strengthening the link forged by her older sister's marriage, and her 5th child, Catherine, married King Henry VIII of England and was mother to Queen Mary I of England. Trade flourished across the Atlantic between Spain and the Americas, and across the Pacific between East Asia and Mexico via the Philippines. Spanish conquistadors, operating privately, deposed the Aztec, Inca, and Maya governments with extensive help from local factions and took control of vast stretches of land. Their massive New World empire began with a genocide of the original populations by disease to which the inhabitants had no resistance. The discovery by the Spanish of this immune deficiency led them to selectively weaponize smallpox and measles. To exploit the gold and silver, the native population was enslaved using the Pope's convert or die exception to the abolition of slavery. In the 1520s, large-scale extraction of silver from the rich deposits of Guanajuato and the silver mines in Zacatecas got underway, and with the conquest of the Central Andes, Bolivia's Potosí mines became available in 1546. Now, these silver shipments reoriented the Spanish economy, leading to the importation of luxuries and grain. The resource-rich colonies of Spain provided large cash inflows. They became indispensable in financing the military capability of Habsburg Spain in its long series of European and North African wars. Though, with the exception of a few years in the 1600s, taxes in Castile were the most important source of revenue, and that financial burden was placed firmly on the backs of the small farmer class, while the nobility enjoyed an increasingly lavish lifestyle. Feudalism in Portugal. Thanks to Rodrigo Borgia, Spain and Portugal had their halves of the world to exploit, and peace reigned between them. In 1529, at Saragossa, Magellan's voyage had required an adjustment of the global split between Western Europe's 2 main papist powers. A dividing line was drawn in the Pacific, and the Moluccas was given to Portugal and the Philippines to Spain. Meanwhile, the energies of Portugal's feudal ruling class had been universally directed into their exploitation zone. Manuel I, coming to the throne in 1495, adopted the title Lord of the Conquest, Navigation, and Commerce of India, Ethiopia, Arabia, and Persia. In Spain, however, there had been a broader spectrum of exploitative interests. From 1519, under the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, Spain not only was concerned with the New World, but with the seesaw politics of mainland Europe. These two bastions of papism needed to maintain friendly relations in order to pursue their respective foreign policies with secure homelands, and accordingly they secured marriages between their crowns. Manuel I of Portugal married 3 successive wives from the Spanish royal family. His son John III, ruling Portugal from 1521 to 1537, is also a brother-in-law of Charles V. In 1525, he married Charles' sister Catherine. In the same year, Charles marries John's sister Isabel. The road to 1588. The conflict between the feudal mode of production and the capitalist mode of production is of concern to us. This conflict was raging between the burgeoning bourgeoisie and feudal families throughout continental Europe and the British Isles. Because these people had no source of knowledge other than the Christian Bible, it took the form of a religious conflict between the Orthodox Christianity of Rome and the Protestant preachers of Northern Europe. The picture can be confusing if one fails to take this thread as the key. It is not the confusing musical chairs of marriages which is significant, but the underlying reality that the war contracting in Spain was notoriously corrupt. In some respects, it's reminiscent of the way in which war contracting in the Gringo Empire is out of control, so the utility of what is purchased is purely secondary to the fact of the purchase. The latter is what the powers that be are interested in because that is the source of their profits. If the boondoggle purchases work, it is totally a matter of secondary or even tertiary concern. Flashing back to the years leading to the destruction of the Spanish Armada in 1588. Francis Drake attacked the Spanish ships of the line in Cadiz in 1597 with an inferior but far better handled force, and this set back Philip's invasion plot by at least a year. In Madrid, it was greeted as a welcome event, making an excuse to spend more money and on building more ships. Pope Sixtus V in Rome knew that if he sent any money up front to Philip, that it would be stolen immediately by the corruption that was the vertebral cord of the Spanish military. He agreed to underwrite the project to a substantial degree only if Philip actually landed troops in England or Scotland and would not send a penny before that. In the event, the assault in Britain in late May 1588 was the beginning, or the assault on Britain in late May 1588 was the beginning of the end of the Spanish global empire. The fleet cost at least 10 million ducats, an unheard of large expenditure for that time. It was 20 years into Spain's 80-year war to destroy Protestantism in the Netherlands, and should have been the tolling of the bell for Spanish feudalism in that campaign. However, the Spanish ruling families were committed to the idea of global domination by keeping capitalism outside their national frontiers, and simultaneously committed to using modern capitalist technology in a safe way. Safe, that is, when compared to Northern Europe, where their feudal counterparts had been taken over by cap bankers. The Dutch armies waged a war of maneuver and siege, avoiding set-piece battles. When Philip's attempt to invade Protestant England in 1588 produced the worst military disaster in Spanish history, as English sailors took advantage of his incompetent commanders, and to storm, the Spanish fleet was lost altogether. Historical records and archaeology show that those ships that sailed around Scotland and crashed on the shores of Ireland were held together like bundles of wooden matchsticks made whole entities by rubber bands. If any of them actually got back to Spain, they and the skeleton surviving crews were never serviceable again. New World gold and silver kept the empire alive, but it was insufficient. economic and administrative problems multiplied in Castile, and the weakness of its oppressed serf farming economy became evident in the following century. Spain declared bankruptcy for the fourth time in 1596, when the 10 million ducats spent but not available came home to roost. Pope Sixtus V was so angry with Philip for fucking up the invasion so completely that he refused to communicate with him. He said his renunciation of any possible payment, relying on the clause of their secret treaty that required Philip to actually land troops in the UK before payment of any kind, and not a single soldier was landed, and thus any Spanish claim was invalid. Sixtus had the secret agreement's documents destroyed. We know about that agreement from the copy received by Elizabeth from her spies in Rome. Elizabeth had been targeted for kidnapping and a public burning in Rome for heresy. In 1600, Spain was barely the leading European power. The Iberian Union with Portugal meant that the monarch of Castile was also the monarch of Portugal. Nevertheless, they had been ruling separately on the peninsula and in the Americas and Brazil. The Great Plague of 1596 to 1602 killed 1,250,000 people, or about 10% of the population, and destroyed the labor force. This depopulation was joined by population loss from war and displacement of farmers. This was the beginning of the intensification of schismatic fighting among Christians, with internecine warfare sparked continuously by class struggles over land and the right to work it. In 1640, Spain's depleted treasury meant Portugal would be forced to pick up the slack, and there was no reason to do so any longer. Ottoman pirates based in Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli were attacking the coastal villages of Spain and the Balearic Islands. Formentera was abandoned by its population, and as were long stretches of the Spanish coast. The famous pirate Redbeard and his pirate fleet captured 250,000 Iberians and sold them as white slaves in the Ottoman Empire. Portugal had no interest in underwriting another failed Spanish military adventure, and the House of Braganza revolted under Spanish rule. Plague, famine, floods, drought, and renewed war with France wasted the country. The Peace of the Pyrenees in 1659 had ended 15 years of warfare with France, whose king, Louis XIV, found the temptation to exploit a weakened Spain too great. Louis instigated the War of Devolution, 1667-68, to acquire the Spanish Netherlands. Through the 1500s and 1600s, the Roman Church and Spain were bound at the hip one to the other, and Spain was free of Protestantism. In 1620, there were 100,000 Spaniards in the clergy. By 1660, the number had grown to about 200,000, and the church owned 20% of all the land in Spain. Under Charles II, councils became the profit centers of wealthy aristocrats, and in rural areas of Spain, heavy taxation of peasants reduced agricultural output, and small farmers in the countryside migrated to the cities. 1/5 of that precious metal, the royal fifth, went to the Spanish treasury, as 4/5 were earmarked for the banks. The Spanish economy depended on the export of luxurious merino wool to markets in northern Europe. The once proud Spanish army was falling far behind its foes. It did badly at Bergen op Zoom in 1622. The Dutch won very easily at Hertogenbosch and Wessel in 1629. In 1632, the Dutch captured the strategic fortress town of Maastricht, repulsing 3 relief armies and dooming the Spanish to defeat. Again, the crown in Spain should have changed course away from the doctrine of keeping capitalism outside its frontiers, but it did not. Spain continued to rely on its American colonies and the silver treasure fleets. The crown policy of keeping capitalism outside of its frontiers meant maintaining the campaign of destroying Protestantism through constant warfare, and denying internal modernization via industrialization. When Philip died in 1598, his treasury was spending most of its income on paying the banks. In peninsular Spain, steady inflation, heavy taxation, immigration of ambitious youth to the colonies, and depopulation wrecked Iberia's future. Seville, in 1621, for example, had 400 looms, where it had 16,000 just 100 years earlier. Spain was a country which had climbed to the heights and sunk to the depths, which had achieved everything and lost everything, which had conquered the world only to be vanquished itself. So spoke one great writer on this period. The Spanish achievement of the 1500s was the work of Castile, as was the Spanish disaster of 1588. Ortega y Gasset expressed the paradox when he wrote the epitaph on the Spain of the House of Austria. Castile has made Spain, and Castile has destroyed it. After many battles, especially in Spain, the Treaty of Utrecht recognized Philip, Duke of Anjou, Louis XIV's grandson, as King of Spain, Philip V, thus confirming the succession stipulated in the will of Charles II of Spain. However, Philip was compelled to renounce for himself and his descendants any right to the French throne, despite some doubts as to the lawfulness of such an act. Spain's Italian territories were apportioned. In 1715, Philip V signed the Decreto de Nueva Planta. This new law revoked most of the historical rights and privileges of the different kingdoms that formed the Spanish crown. Spain became culturally and politically a follower of absolutist France. Lynch says Philip V advanced the government only marginally over that of his predecessors and was more of a liability than the incapacitated Charles II. Philip made reforms in government and strengthened the central authorities relative to the provinces. Merit became more important, although most senior positions still went to the landed aristocracy. And below the elite level, inefficiency and corruption was as widespread as ever. The reforms started by Philip V culminated in the reforms of Charles III. However, most policymakers had as their objective reinforcement of the monarchy, empire, and feudal aristocracy with church control over education. Now comes the disintegration at home and abroad. Jockeying with Europe's quadruple alliance resulted in a Spanish defeat, concession, and temporary withdrawal from Sardinia and Sicily. Later, the Spanish crown reneged on earlier promises and invaded Naples. All this nonsense continued as the Bourbons of Spain under Ferdinand VI continued their way, and Charles III to try to regain their old profit centers, fearing that Britain's victory over France in the 7 Years' War, 1756–63, threatened all hope of regaining the cap profits centers of the Netherlands. Spain allied itself to France and invaded Portugal, a British ally. As usual, the Spanish crown was pathetically inept on the ground, and after a series of military defeats, ended up having to cede Florida to the British at the Treaty of Paris in 1763 in exchange for gaining Louisiana from Spain. Spain regained Florida with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which ended the American Revolutionary War 1775 to 1781. By the 1770s, the conservatives had launched a counterattack and used censorship and the Inquisition to suppress Enlightenment ideas. There was no legal challenge to the Roman Church. In the late 1700s, Bourbon-ruled Spain had an alliance with Bourbon-ruled France, and therefore did not have to fear a land war. Its only serious enemy was Britain, which had a powerful navy. Spain therefore concentrated its resources on its navy. In the 1780s, on top of Spain were the monarchy, then the nobility and the church bosses, in total a few hundred families. Below them came the overseer class of 500,000, and then there were 200,000 churchmen and women in heavily endowed monasteries whose task it was to control the minds of the unfree farming masses. The latter came in two serf classes. One lived on latifundia, and the other as small farmers. There were shopkeepers and artisan professionals that constituted a petty bourgeois that was not burgeoning. In 1789, the French Revolution overthrew the Bourbons. Then a land war with France became a threat, which the king knew his pathetic officer corps could not win. That officer corps was selected for class loyalty and payment for offices. Merits was the last, if ever, considered factor. On the other hand, a third of the junior officers had been promoted from the ranks and were champing at the bit for the kind of opportunity offered by the French for officers in their revolutionary army that had given them Bonaparte. The rank and file were capitalist farmers at best, or unfortunate conscripts. The Spanish king had to rely on foreigners to do any kind of shock attack or specialist activity such as artillery or combat engineering, and included Irishmen, Italians, Swiss, and Walloons. Spain was forced into an alliance with France and then was blockaded by the British. However, Charles IV failed to honor his French alliance. So on the 16th of February in 1808, Bonaparte invaded Spain, triggering the Peninsular War, and most importantly, Spain's eventual loss of the entire New World. Meanwhile, capitalism was transforming Great Britain, the Low Countries, and France, but was still de facto outlawed in Spain. The chaos unleashed by the Peninsular War caused that economic gap to widen. The French invasion proved the Spanish army was futile in resistance. In the event, the army was so unreliable that its generals were fragged for incompetence, not that it mattered because they had no idea about what they were supposed to be doing. The 2nd of May, 1808 was the beginning of the popular Spanish resistance against Napoleon. In the king's Spanish army, junior officers from peasant families deserted and went over to the insurgents. These were what we would call lieutenants and NCOs. The army melted away in place. Conditions steadily worsened as the insurgents increasingly took control of Spain's battle against Napoleon. Napoleon ridiculed the army as the worst in Europe. The British, who had had to work with it, agreed. It was not the army that defeated Napoleon, but the insurgent capitalist farmers. They were equivalents of the same class that had fueled Oliver Cromwell's invincible new model army in the 1600s. In 1812, the king's Spanish army controlled only scattered enclaves and could only harass the French with occasional raids. The morale of the army had reached a nadir, and combat NCOs stripped the aristocratic officers of most of their legal privileges. Losing the New World. The defeat of the British invasions of the Rio de la Plata in South America in 1806 and 1807 emboldened independence and revolutionary hopes in Spain's North and South American colonies. Napoleon's invasion of Spain in February 1808 had deposed Fernando VII. On July 20th, 1808, Joseph Bonaparte, eldest brother of Napoleon Bonaparte, entered Madrid and established a government where he became King of Spain, serving as a surrogate for Napoleon. In May 8, 1808, as we have seen, Spaniards revolted. Juntas were formed all across Spain that pronounced in favor of Fernando VII. On September 26, 1808, a central junta was formed in the town of Aranjuez to coordinate the nationwide struggle against the French, and initially the central junta declared support for Fernando VII and convened a general and extraordinary cortes for all the kingdoms of the Spanish monarchy. On February 22nd and 23rd of 1809, a popular insurrection against the French occupation broke out all over Spain. The Peninsular Campaign was a disaster for France. Napoleon did well when he was in direct command, but when he left in 1809, conditions grew worse for France. Vicious reprisals, famously portrayed by Goya in the Disasters of War, only made the Spanish guerrillas angrier and more active. The war in Spain proved to be a major long-term drain on French money, manpower, and prestige. In June 1808, the Spanish army inflicted the first major defeat suffered by a Napoleonic army, resulting in the collapse of French power in Spain. Napoleon took personal charge and with fresh forces reconquered Spain in a matter of months, defeating the Spanish and British armies in a brilliant campaign of encirclement. After this, the Spanish armies lost every battle they fought against the French imperial forces, but were never annihilated. Their new strategy was to retreat into the mountains, regroup, and launch hit-and-run raids. Guerrilla forces sprang up all over the country. Napoleon's troops found themselves at a loss against concentrated guerrilla attacks that became a massive drain on Napoleon's military and economic resources. The brutal war was one of the first guerrilla wars in modern history. French supply lines stretched across Spain and were perfect targets for guerrilla forces. The British and Portuguese, led by the Duke of Wellington, aided Spain, who fought Napoleon's forces in the Peninsular War. Wellington spent several years in his fortresses in Portugal while launching occasional campaigns into Spain. In March of 1812, the Cádiz Cortes created the first modern Spanish constitution, the Constitution of 1812. Now, this constitution provided for a separation of the powers of the executive and legislative branches of government. The Cortes was to be elected by universal suffrage by an indirect method. Each member of the Cortes was to represent 70,000 people. Members of the Cortes were to meet in annual sessions. The king prevented from either convening or proroguing the Cortes. Members of the Cortes were to serve single 2-year terms, and they could not serve consecutive terms. A member could serve a second term only by allowing someone else to serve a single intervening term in office. And this attempt at the development of a modern constitutional government lasted from 1808 until 1814. After Napoleon's disastrous 1812 campaign in Russia, he began to recall his forces for the defense of France. Russian and its coalition forces required Bonaparte to leave Spain undermanned and on the defensive against the advancing Spanish, British, and Portuguese army. In 1814, Fernando VII was restored as King of Spain. This was after the Battle of Vittoria in 1813, when the Duke of Wellington had decisively defeated the French. Spain lost all of its North and South American colonies except Cuba and Puerto Rico in a complex series of revolts from 1808 to 1826. Spain was at war with Britain from 1798 to 1808, and the British Navy cut off its ties to its colonies. Trade was handled by American and Dutch traders, and the American colonies achieved economic independence from Spain and set up temporary junta governments out of touch with the mother country. After 1814, as Napoleon was defeated and Fernando VII was back on the throne, he sent armies to regain control and reimpose his rule in the New World. In round one, they were successful. A second round featured the return of the military leaders from the Peninsular War, and in that round, number 2, 1816 to 1825, they were successful. They drove the Spanish off the New World continents altogether, and Spain had no help from Europe or the USA. When they had been cut off from Spain, the American colonies saw a struggle for power between Spaniards who were born in Spain, the Peninsulares, and those of Spanish descent born in New Spain, or Creoles. The Creoles were activists for independence. Multiple revolutions enabled them to break free of the mother country. In 1824, the armies of Generals José de San Martín of Argentina and Simón Bolívar of the Venezuela defeated the last Spanish forces. Spain's final defeat came at the Battle of Ayacucho in southern Peru. Business and trade in the ex-colonies were under British control. Spain kept only Cuba and Puerto Rico in the New World. The Napoleonic Wars had severe negative effects on Spain's long-term economic development. The Peninsular War ravaged towns and countryside alike, and the demographic impact was the worst of any Spanish war, with a sharp decline in population caused by casualties, emigration, and the disruption of family life. The marauding armies seized farmers' crops and much of their livestock. Sheep and cattle had been their main capital asset. Severe poverty became widespread, reducing market demand, and disruption of local and international trade and the shortage of critical inputs seriously hurt industry and services. The loss of a vast colonial empire reduced Spain's overall wealth. By 1820, Spain, where industrial capitalism had been outlawed, had become one of Europe's poorest and least developed societies. The only industry was in textiles in Catalonia. Natural resources such as coal and iron were available, but the transportation system was rudimentary and crude. Spain had only a few canals or navigable rivers, and road travel was slow and expensive. British railroad builders did not invest, and eventually a small railway system was built, radiating from Madrid and bypassing the natural resources. The government relied on high tariffs, especially on grain, which further slowed economic development. Eastern Spain was unable to import inexpensive Italian wheat and had to rely on expensive homegrown products carted in over poor roads. The export market collapsed apart from some agricultural products. Castile remained the political and cultural center, uninterested in industry. 3/4 of Spain's people were illiterate. The government was bankrupt and unable to pay its soldiers. Florida was sold to the United States for $5 million. In 1820, an expedition intended for the colonies revolted in Cadiz. When armies throughout Spain pronounced themselves in sympathy with the revolt, Fernando relented and was forced to accept the liberal constitution of 1812. This was the start of the second bourgeois revolution in Spain. It would last from 1820 to 1823. Fernando was placed under house arrest during that liberal experiment. The liberal government reminded European statesmen of the governments of the French Revolution and was viewed with hostility by the Congress of Verona in 1822. France was authorized to intervene, and in so doing crushed the liberal government with massive force in the so-called 100,000 Sons of St. Louis expedition. In 1823, Fernando was restored as absolute monarch, and this marked the end of the Second Spanish Bourgeois Revolution. The failure of the Second Bourgeois Revolution was followed by a period of uneasy peace for the next decade. Fernando decreed the Pragmatic Sanction of 1830, enabling his daughter Isabel to become queen. Fernando's death in 1833 and the accession of Isabel II as Queen of Spain sparked the First Carlist War from 1833 to 1839. Now, Isabel was only 3 years old at the time, so her mother, Maria Cristina of Bourbon II Sicilies, was named regent until her daughter came of age. Fernando's brother Carlos gathered forces in Portugal and invaded the Basque Country in the north of Spain. Liberals under Isabel and reactionaries under Carlos fought two Carlist wars. In 1836, General Baldomero Espartero, at the head of Isabel's liberals, fought and won the Battle of Lucana, turning the tide of the war, and in 1839, the Convention of Vergara put an end to the first Carlist insurrection. In 1840, the progressive General Espartero became regent for Isabella and replaced the rather reactionary Marina Cristina. Moderates then opposed Espartero's liberal reforms, and there were a series of uprisings throughout the country from reactionaries that were bloodily suppressed. In 1843, however, they succeeded in overthrowing his regency, substituting Ramon Maria Narvaez. Another Carlist uprising, the Martínez War, was launched in 1846 in Catalonia, but was poorly organized and suppressed by 1849. Isabel II of Spain took a more active role in government after coming of age, but she was immensely unpopular throughout her reign of 1833 to 1868. Consequently, there was another insurrection in 1854 led by General Domingo Dulce Igare and General Leopoldo O'Donnell y Geras. Their coup overthrew the dictatorship of Luis José Sartorius, the first Count of San Luis. As the result of the popular insurrection, the Progressive Party, Partido Progresista, gained support coming into power in 1854. In 1856, Isabel failed to overthrow her own government, and in 1860, Isabel launched a successful war against Morocco, led by Generals O'Donnell and Juan Prim. Alongside the French, Spain intervened in Cochin China in 1857 to 63, that is in Southeast Asia or Vietnam, and Mexico in 1861 to 62. Then the government accepted Santo Domingo's return to the Spanish Empire, extending its military presence in the Pacific off the South American coast. In 1866, a revolt led by Juan Prim was suppressed. In 1868, there was another revolt, Progresista generals Francisco Serrano and Juan Prim rising against Isabel and her moderate generals at the Battle of Alcolea, led the Glorious Revolution. They were defeated, but Isabel was driven into Parisian exile. In 1870, the Cortes declared that Spain would again have a king, Amadis of Savoy. The second son of King Victor Emmanuel II of Italy was selected and duly crowned King of Spain in 1871. Spain's defeat by the USA in 1898 opened the door to modern capitalism. And that brings us to a conclusion of this particular lecture. In the next one, we're going to move on to feudalism to capitalism in France.